Kubi Ackerman, and I'm the director of the Future City Lab here at the museum, and we're very happy to have you here tonight for the second event in our Housing Tomorrow's City program series, which is inspired by the Future City Lab, which is the interactive third gallery that's part of our New York at its Core exhibition, which covers 400 years of New York City's history and its future. I'd also like to let you know about our next program in the series, which is Rooted in Place, Stories of Home in the City, which is coming up on Thursday, February 28th. That program will take a look at the emotional and psychological dimensions of making and maintaining, and in some cases losing, home in a place like New York, and will be moderated by Tanvi Misra, also of City Lab. So most of us are probably familiar with the broad outlines of the housing crisis. New York's population is growing faster than our housing stock is increasing, which is putting upward pressure on housing costs and resulting in the wave of gentrification, in some cases displacement, that's washing over many of our neighborhoods in the city. And the de Blasio administration has an ambitious plan, which is already underway, to preserve or create hundreds of thousands of units of affordable housing. But there's a lot of questions that remain about that program, such as which communities are being targeted for development, whether what's deemed affordable is actually affordable, and whether the entire program itself is adequate to meet the needs and to meet the scale of the crisis. And if the answer to that is no, what are the alternatives? Is this simply a market scarcity problem, or are more far-reaching and creative ideas needed? So that's really what we're here to learn about tonight. And the timing really couldn't be more critical. With, on the one hand, we have the Amazon headquarters likely to increase pressures on housing prices throughout the city, and on the other hand, a newly empowered Democratic leadership in Albany, which is likely to act on housing issues early in the next legislative session. So we really need bold ideas, and we're likely to hear many of those tonight. So with that, please join me in welcoming our moderator, Kristen Capps.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm grateful for the Museum of the City of New York for inviting me. When we talk about housing affordability, it's often very narrow questions about zoning, development, and issues that play out at the community level, at the city council level. This is a great opportunity to look a little bit broader than the sometimes contentious ways that we discuss zoning reform in New York City and everywhere else. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce tonight's presenters and our panel. Roseanne Haggerty is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Community Solutions, an organization launched in 2011 to help communities solve the problems that create homelessness. Haggerty is a MacArthur Foundation Fellow, Ashoka Senior Fellow, and Hunt Alternative Fund Prime Mover. Howard Husick is the Vice President for Research and Publications at the Manhattan Institute, where he also serves as the Director of their Social Entrepreneurship Initiative. He is the author of a number of books, including Philanthropy Under Fire, published in 2013. Deyanira Del Rio is the co-director of the New Economy Project, whose mission is to build an economy that works for all based on cooperation, equity, social and racial justice, and ecological sustainability. Del Rio is also the board chair of the Lower East Side People's Federal Credit Union and the New York City Community Land Initiative. Finally, Mo George is the executive director of Picture the Homeless. Picture the Homeless's numerous activities include passing legislation for the Housing Not Warehousing Act to remove thousands of units from being warehoused by landlords and placed back into active units. She was recently recognized as one of the city and state New York's Brooklyn Power 50. Each of our panelists will come and present, and then we'll join you for a conversation.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And I'm Roseanne Haggerty. I guess we will introduce ourselves. But I'll start with just asking, what if our housing crisis in New York City is only partly about the amount of housing we have and what it costs? Just like ending polio was only partly, and it's almost there worldwide, only partly about having a vaccine. Now, the polio vaccine was developed in 1953, but this picture was taken just a few years ago in Nigeria, where the World Health Organization and the local health system and let's say, I think the CDC and the Gates Foundation, a whole network of international organizations, were working with the country to actually deal with a more fundamental problem, because the vaccine had existed a long time, but what didn't exist was a distribution system, was a way of connecting that needed intervention with everyone who required it down to the last mile. And so what has made the difference in the last places on the planet where polio is endemic is an approach that actually grew out of global health and smallpox eradication, but you'll find this approach in aviation, manufacturing, wherever there is a really complicated problem that requires multi-level cooperation and a commitment to solve for the whole. You'll see three things present. And they're here in this picture. You see a team, from the international experts to the local inoculators. You see data, not just something that's been pulled off the internet for a reference, but this is real-time, person-specific data to guide the next set of actions. And you have a whole team understanding that their job is to constantly iterate and problem solve and change up what they're doing until the problem is solved to the last mile. Well, this zero mindset that really drives a different way of thinking about problems that are too complicated for just one policy intervention or one group or one idea. What if housing in New York and in other places where there is a total misalignment between the housing that's needed and the housing that is occupied in a sustainable way by our populations. What if we were to think about it actually as a complex systems problem, more like a global health challenge or the challenge of making sure all the parts connect if you're building a Toyota. There are other places we can look for ideas about how to identify a problem correctly, and then how to train ourselves to solve it. And I think our work really took a new and very powerful direction when we started asking ourselves, what if homelessness, a problem we've been working on for many years, is actually the symptom, and that the problem we had to understand and learn to work differently on was a broken housing system. And if you kind of move your mind into that space, the question looks really different. You start asking, what kind of team would we need in order to actually deal with a healthy housing system, and starting from ending homelessness? You would need, we've learned, the mayor or county executive's office all in, and the people with the health and mental health resources who are directing the policy. You'd need the housing authority. You'd need the not-for-profit organizations and others who were receiving resources either for capital or operating or social services subsidies. You'd need the VA. Sometimes if you're dealing with veteran homelessness or veterans at risk of homelessness, they're a key actor. You'd need all of those entities to be understanding the problem in the same way, sharing a measurable common goal, and with a commitment to reaching the last mile, working back from the end to see that the problem was solved, in this case of homelessness, but as a pathway to actually having a healthier housing system. And so what kind of data would you need to tell you whether you were making progress? Well, what we've learned is you need really different kind of data than most communities were ever collecting on homelessness. You need to know who is homeless today. What is different about the way each person or family is experiencing this problem? Because homelessness is really too big a category to tell you enough to solve the problem even of one person. And you'd need to know who's coming into homelessness and how could we learn how to stop that? What broke down for them? You need to know who came back into homelessness after you housed them because something broke down there that's a different problem to fix. And you'd need to know who's resolving the problem on their own. And a proxy for that is people who you had once worked with in your city system, but seem to have just disappeared. And you don't lose track of them forever, but you aren't holding a place on a waiting list if there's an available apartment for them. And so it seems like a very daunting challenge in a place where the point in time count is the way we understand what's going on in homelessness year after year. But what if it's actually possible to do this, and that lots of cities are having real-time, by-name information on who's experiencing homelessness the capacity to triage and understand the nature of each individual and family's problems and to quickly connect them to the housing resource and support that will resolve their problem. And what if, once you have the capacity to have that data, you were to create an entirely new culture for organizations to work in? Back like that photograph I showed you of the team in Nigeria, where it's not about coming up with the right plan, it's actually acquiring the right skills to problem solve every day, to keep moving forward and figuring out where the blockages are and solving problem after problem. And what if that wasn't just an aspiration, that we could learn to work that way and that communities could see new success and that there's something New York City might learn from that? Because with the communities that are practicing this kind of approach to homelessness as a way to build a healthy housing system, we now see in the last almost 4 years that there are 11 places that have solidly ended chronic homelessness or veteran homelessness, that are reducing homelessness month over month, that without new resources other than the infusion of supports for veterans that are coming regularly from the federal government, there are almost 100,000 chronic and veteran homeless individuals housed because these communities have understood the problem as a systems problem and have learned to work in new ways. And what if New York could learn to do that too? Thank you.
Okay, I'm Howard Husing from the Manhattan Institute. We in New York face two overriding housing policy goals: how to increase supply for a city growing toward 9 million, and how to help ensure that there's housing that a wide range of households can afford. One way that both the current administration and the Bloomberg administration before it has sought to achieve those goals involves the city's public housing system. The idea of infilling on public housing land has focused heretofore on building new developments on underused public housing parking lots. The proposal I'm about to explain, developed with the help of the architecture firm Curtis & Ginsburg, approaches the potential of public housing sites to accommodate more housing as well as commercial uses from a quite different perspective. I call it re-streeting, breaking up the superblocks which cut housing developments off from their surrounding neighborhoods by restoring streets which once existed and using the new building sites which are created as a result for housing and stores and community facilities. The proposal I'll outline involves zero housing demolition. It'll bring revenue to the housing authority. It'll help restore the dangerously deteriorated system. It'll create safer green spaces for current and new residents alike. We're going to look at one specific example, the Pelham Parkway houses in the Bronx. It's a very typical NYCHA project with about 23 six-story brick buildings. Some quick background. The kind of style that you see that this is built in was not inevitable. About 90 years ago, when NYCHA got going, it made two big decisions. One, it was going to demolish working-class neighborhoods and create clean slates on which to build towers in the park architecture. And those living in such towers in the park, and this was cheered on by a landmark exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in 1934, and then later implemented by Robert Moses, were profoundly influenced by the Swiss architect who wrote under the name Le Corbusier. The plan, wrote Le Corbusier, must rule. We should strive to walk over a clean surface. We have to build new cities. Our streets no longer work. Streets themselves are obsolete. There ought not to be such things as streets. We have to create something that will replace them. And we did. And that's why towers in the park all over New York exist today, and the people who live there are living in Le Corbusier's vision. But by the 1960s, that was quite controversial. In a landmark book that many of you know, I'm sure, Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs, she attacked Le Corbusier. And she imagined exactly what I'm proposing tonight, re-streeting. Streets must tie in, the projects must tie in with streets beyond their borders, because the prime object is to knit the site with what lies around it. The apartment buildings can become street buildings, their ground floors redesigned, incorporated into streets and new uses. We should aim to bring in uses different from residents because enough new uses are precisely, the lack of new uses are precisely the causes of deadness, danger, and inconvenience. That's Jane Jacobs. And that is just about exactly what architect Mark Ginsburg and his team, who are here tonight, have developed for the southern side of the Pelham Parkway houses. Let's take a tour of their idea. For context, here's where the development is in the mid-Bronx. There was a time when the surrounding streets cut through the site, much as we're proposing. Let's go to see the history. Next slide. They moved those away to create the public housing site. There were walk-up apartments and small stores standing there. This is true of all the NYCHA projects, by the way. This was demolished. You can see that the streets stop at the project's border today. The re-streeting that I'm proposing envisions extending those streets, opening them to traffic, and creating sites for new buildings that would face the streets. We see the adjacent surrounding building heights ranging from 11 to 17 stories. And here we see that this is a practical solution in terms of current zoning requirements. The Curtis and Ginsburg team has come up with several possible plans. It includes 3 building types: 3-story townhouses, 4-story walk-ups, an elevator apartment building going up to 17 stories, and a mix of housing types and commercial buildings. Those are the buildings. They don't exist yet. We're hoping they're going to exist, just to be very clear. The existing green space behind the new buildings would be cordoned off for their residents, and so will the existing green space for the public housing tenants. Both areas would require access by electronic fob to prevent non-residents from congregating there for non-legal purposes. The new streets would be owned by the housing authority. Property revenues would go to the housing authority. And the corners would be places where new supermarkets could be developed, retail space, drugstores, bodegas, small service stores. The housing authority would be in a position to realize serious new revenues from this. They could have ground leases with the property owners, tax increment finance districts. We've used comparable buildings in the neighborhood and their taxable value to compute that the buildings that we propose, and there are 272 units, would lead to the new revenue of $2 million a year for the housing authority just for this property. And that revenue could be reinvested in the Pelham Parkway houses, which right now, like many NYCHA projects, only has heat and water because of a huge mobile boiler portable system. We know about the lack of heat and hot water in NYCHA. This is an extremely typical housing development. I walked from the Lexington Avenue subway through, I believe it was the Wagner houses, maybe it was the Grant houses, to get here. It's the same layout. There are probably 200 layouts like this in New York. We could be talking about 40 to 50,000 new units infilled on NYCHA, new improvements made because of the revenue that would be realized. This is an approach to end the isolation of public housing tenants, reduce crime, and improve the amenities for low-income New Yorkers. And we'd have a new name, if the residents agree, to the Pelham Parkway houses. We'd call it the Jane Jacobs houses. Thank you very much, and I invite you after the whole program to look at our 3D printed model. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everybody. Everyone's doing such a good job staying on time. I'm going to try to stick to that. So I wanted to thank the museum for inviting our organization to be here, and I'm excited to share a very different kind of view and frame for our work on housing and related neighborhood development based on our work over 22 years with community-based organizations throughout New York City. I'm going to talk about an idea, and I think Mo following me is going to build on it, around, this is an idea that is bold but not new, and it's around developing community land trusts around New York City and essentially taking land and housing out of the speculative market, decommodifying housing, and placing it in the hands of communities to steward and ensure remain permanently affordable for the long term. So how's that for bold ideas in New York City? So I want to start with a little bit of landscaping, because our organization, which is called New Economy Project, and currently, we spend a lot of our time working with community groups and their members in low-income neighborhoods and immigrant communities, in neighborhoods of color. We're focused really deeply and concretely on creating affirmative solutions to economic inequality, to our housing, and so many other crises. But there's most of our work in our initial decade plus was really focused on kind of helping groups respond to threats and address redlining and disinvestment that really shaped the way New York City looks in terms of our segregated neighborhoods and our unequal housing and other kind of opportunities. So this is a good old-fashioned, bad old-fashioned redlining map that shows where banks are and are not located in New York City, and the vacant white spaces represent zip codes where there are virtually no bank branches serving people who live in those communities. And the diagonal overlays show where the people living in those neighborhoods are more than 70% not white. So these are predominantly Black and Latino and other communities of color. If I showed you the lending maps that show where banks make loans, you'll see the same pattern. And this is something that has persisted for decades, right? So a lot of our work initially was helping groups develop strategies to bring investment into their neighborhoods, to create truly affordable housing, to allow low-income people to purchase their homes, to create local small businesses and provide jobs in their neighborhoods, and all the things that you need capital for, right, to create a healthy community. So in the late 90s, really quickly, our work shifted, and that is when the sort of flood of destabilizing, predatory credit in neighborhoods of color really just began in earnest. This was just an avalanche, a tsunami, whatever you want to call it. It was literally a catastrophe, and harmed and stripped billions of dollars of wealth out of neighborhoods of color in New York City. And one of the things that we worked on for a very long time was a subprime lending explosion and then an ensuing foreclosure crisis. And so if you look at where the banks are present and are not present and not making loans, and then where you have subprime lending, which looks like this map, and the foreclosure crisis, you just see that housing in many ways and the sort of surrounding financial industry has really served to harm people in neighborhoods of color for a very long time. And fast forward to today, and I should say, we could show maps of predatory equity schemes that sort of pull rent-regulated housing out of the market, and many other kinds of patterns, and they'll sort of reflect the same maps that you see right now. But fast forward to today, right? And I think that landscaping is important because it really shaped and I think has allowed groups in New York and policymakers and others to be a little bit bolder in their thinking and to think beyond how do we help more people get a piece of the pie and sort of tap into home ownership and build wealth for themselves and then move on. And instead of this kind of one by one trying to work and help people within the system, what if we changed that frame a little bit? And what if, again, we thought of housing as a human right? What if we thought about our homes and where we raise our families and build our support networks, not as something that is going to be bought and sold so that we can generate wealth for ourselves and move on, but what if housing should be something that is provided to everybody so that low-income people in New York City, homeless and formerly homeless families, have a place to live and to get back on their feet. And so you have today this, real, I think, bold and very deeply rooted in racial justice movement for community land trusts throughout New York City. And our organization, along with others on this panel, we're part of a citywide coalition called the New York City Community Land Initiative that's advancing land trusts specifically for this purpose. And you have now New York City is a hotbed. Did you all know that this is a hotbed here for community land trusts? and innovation, and there's a movement that's going big. But seriously, can you raise your hands? Now I can actually see you all. Raise your hands if you've heard of community land trust before tonight. Oh, that's excellent. Okay. I'm really excited to hear that. Ooh, 2 minutes, okay. So maybe you don't need to know this, but this is just one visual that we use. Maybe you know this already, but it's sort of demonstrating that the community land trust, what it is in essence, is a way, again, to take land out of this kind of market and put it in the hands of community members so that they can own that land, make decisions together about what happens on top, what gets built, what are the affordability restrictions for housing, does the community need more space for worker co-ops that are starting in the neighborhood, community gardens and really critical and often scarce green space in their neighborhoods, what are the needs? And the land trust becomes this entity that makes those decisions and then enters into what are called ground leases with the housing or whatever is built on top. And it's an extremely flexible model that has existed for a very long time. It has roots in civil rights struggles. I would highly recommend you watch the documentary Arc of Justice to learn about its roots in Georgia. And there's more than 200 CLTs around the country that are preserving deeply, truly affordable rental housing, home ownership, and again, many other commercial and community spaces. And we want to see that in New York. And so this is a map that shows a network that that has been called the CLT Learning Exchange. And there are a dozen groups here, including Community Solutions, including the East Harlem El Barrio CLT in this neighborhood, which Picture the Homeless helped to get off the ground, along with our organization and many others. And groups all over the city, many with long histories of fighting for housing and other kinds of rights, environmental justice struggles in the South Bronx, and so on, tenant organizers. And each of these CLTs has been meeting over the past year through intensive peer learning, monthly sessions, through technical assistance, and they're working on getting their land trusts off the ground so that they can provide affordable housing that's actually affordable in their communities, so that they can take housing and land, including many, many properties that the city owns, and actually transfer those into the land trust so that those residents have better outcomes in their lives. These are just a few pictures of popular education that's happening in neighborhoods, deep organizing, door-to-door surveying, and there's a board game that our coalition developed called Trustville. It's really amazing. And this is the black and white is a photo of Cooper Square, which is the local CLT that has been around for decades and is actually preserving affordable housing for families that are earning as low as 30% of the area median income, which is really low by affordable housing standards. And so there's just an incredible, tremendous amount of work being done. And one of the things that we think is really vital is that the people and the neighborhoods that are most excluded and the most harmed by our current economy, by our current housing market, should be at the table making some of these decisions. And what if that was the way policy got done in New York? Thank you.
Hello, folks. I can't see any of y'all because of these lights, but I know the room's packed. As it says, I'm the executive director of Picture the Homeless. I've been there, January will make 2 years now. And one thing we do is imagine what housing looks like. Actually, that's 90% of what we do, because our organization is made up of folks who are currently street homeless, formerly homeless, in shelters, in transitional housing, supportive housing. So when we got to this question around bold ideas, especially after we passed this legislation and that it got enacted at the beginning of the year, around the warehousing of apartments. So we thought, like, as we looked at them, we were like, well, now that we've passed the Housing Not Warehousing Act, which really put, I think it's about 8,000 to 9,000 units back onto the rental rolls, we're like, well, who can access those apartments? That's really the question. And we started looking at some of our older ideas and how our new ideas can come from the older ideas and what's next. So we're just starting this research now, So it's not all, I don't have all the answers because we're working on it, but here's what members and myself came up with. So old ideas, build luxury housing, right? 250 units since 2014, and currently about 41% occupied. That's the key figure to remember. Build affordable housing, right? We know the mayor's plan, supposedly up to now, has financed more than 2,400 affordable housing units, and he broke an all-time record, so they say, and nearly half of these homes serve people making less than 33%, or 43,000 for a family of three. Then the other option is give public land to developers, which is like one of my colleagues talked about NYCHA's habit of actually erecting buildings on NYCHA property. Then the continued public housing disinvestment that has gotten us here, years and years of disinvestment in public housing. So the new ideas, community land trust. Jay just talked about it. They just talked about community land trust being actually owned by folks in the community, folks who've been in buildings. I sit on the board of the East Harlem El Barrio Community Land Trust. Well, I used to. But Picture the Homeless has somebody on there. And in the buildings, there are folks who've been in that building 30 or 40 years. And if you ask them, the first thing that they would talk about is like they would love to buy their apartment, right? Because it would guarantee affordability for themselves and their kids that live with them and folks that's after. So the next idea, evolved in community land trust is we said, well, what is the next step if people in community land trust are standing there saying that they want to be able to buy their apartments? And we looked, and folks looked, and I knew, and we remembered Mitchell-Lama. So how many folks here remember the Mitchell-Lama program? Right. So a little bit about Mitchell-Lama, started by Senator McNeil Mitchell and Assemblyman Alfred Lama. And at the time, what it did was it actually allowed folks really to purchase their apartments, right? The Mitchell-Lama program still exists. Good luck getting on the waiting list, right? But it is actually housing goal. Actually, to be really transparent, my partner actually is on the waiting list and got accepted and called for a Mitchell-Lama apartment. So now I'm telling her that either she takes it or we're breaking up. Because neither one of us are going to be able to afford this city. So what we thought about, and we're, like I said, in the process of learning more around the Mitchell-Lama program, because we said, and when I say we, I'm talking myself and members, if the community land trust folks are saying they want to buy their apartment and they could afford, some of the rates that the Mitchell-Lama apartment's going to, as much as $24,000, and yet luxury housing is actually only 41% occupied in the city, then you're talking about tons and tons of apartments that are sitting vacant, right? And what if there was a combination between those building owners and the city and state around allowing those empty apartments to go under the Mitchell-Lama program and actually allow folks who can't afford $250,000, but could probably put together $24,000, myself, to get into those apartments and actually live and own those apartments and be able to transfer ownership of those apartments to their loved ones. So right now what we're doing is we're looking more and more. We're looking more and more at the Mitchell-Lama program and talking to experts, brighter than us, to see the intricacies in the program and see how it actually can connect and combine with what we know about community land trust. And our feeling is that community land trust, reimagination of Mitchell-Lama, bold new housing. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you for all of those presentations. I have a lot of questions, but I'll probably only get to a few of them. I wanted to start with you, Diana, since Mo kind of invoked your idea in kind of bringing in community land trusts and a discussion of Mitchell-Lama. Can you talk about Mitchell-Lama and what you think that could accomplish?
Well, first of all, I want to say that Picture the Homeless and its members were really the ones that revived the idea of community land trusts in recent years. And so it's their idea. And unfortunately, no, I cannot speak to Mitchell Lama. That is not an area of
It's
our
a brand new idea. Don't blame Day. She's just
That
hearing about it.
Is an excellent answer. Okay, I'll come back to you. Roseanne, we were talking before we started about veterans' homelessness, which has seen a really considerable push and has even been, effectively ended in several communities. Can you talk about veterans' homelessness and how, as a category, that works? And what about that maybe, what about a systems focus has accomplished that goal?
Sure. The ending veteran homelessness.
You want mine?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ending veteran homelessness was a priority set by the Obama administration. And interestingly, this idea of collaboration, it was General Shinseki, who was the VA secretary at the time, and Sean Donovan, the HUD secretary, really locked arms to say, how do our agencies work together in new ways, and modeled the kind of collaboration that really took a while, but sort of managed to work its way down to local housing authorities and VA medical centers. But what was key was Congress allocated new VA supportive housing, or VASH vouchers,
Right.
to take the financial barriers out of the way. But to the systems question, we didn't see the kind of progress toward getting veterans housed for a few years because there wasn't a system to connect the dots. The VA, in many cases, didn't know who the veterans were. If they weren't actually linked to the VA, they were kind of on their own in city shelters or on the street. Often the VA, with the case management resources, they'd never met the people at the housing authority who were processing the vouchers. And so where we began to see real acceleration in reducing veteran homelessness is when these groups started meeting, started sharing the same goals, started sharing data, started measuring regularly whether veteran homelessness was decreasing in a community, not just relying on a once-a-year PIT count. So it's really this combination I spoke to of actually getting the right people working together as a team with the right information about who's experiencing the problem and just continuing to drive improvement.
Okay, I'm going to hand this one back to you. Thank you. Howard, I wanted to talk to you about the Jane Jacobs houses, or that particular kind of concept for thinking about public housing. Who provides, where do you see the initial investment coming from? And is this a project that you want NYCHA to oversee?
No, NYCHA would just make it possible. This is a project that can be funded by private investors.
Uh-huh.
And in fact, the beauty part of it, as they say in Brooklyn, would be the land can be free. This is land that the city owns. So the de facto subsidy is free land that's already assembled. We subsidize a lot of housing in New York. In fact, we subsidize more housing than any other city. We regulate more housing than any other city. Yet we seem to have the worst housing crisis of any other city. So something is wrong with that picture. And the idea that we could put this land that the city owns already to private developer use would require no investment from NYCHA. NYCHA would, in fact, reap the benefits through realizing revenue. And the residents would realize benefits because, we talk about food deserts. The worst food deserts in the city are public housing. They're the most distant from grocery stores. So this proposal tries not just to increase the supply of housing, although that's key, but to make life better for NYCHA residents who are already there.
Is there any mechanism in this proposal for making or adding to healthier communities, or is it just something that the market is going to have to decide one way or the other?
What do you mean by healthier communities?
I'm thinking about the kind of retail that ends up near public housing and whether there is a way to ensure that grocery stores are involved in the mix.
Yeah, I think that when you have a space that is large enough for a grocery store, the likelihood is that grocery stores will locate there. In fact, for a paper I did for the Manhattan Institute on Food Deserts, I talked to John Catsimatidis, who, in addition to being a radio talk show host, apparently runs a chain of supermarkets. Who knew? But he does, the Red Apple supermarkets. He said he'd love to locate in public housing. If he can get the rents that would be reasonable, and he wants security, that's what he said. But when you have markets that are underserved but don't have space in which to locate to serve those markets, well, by building, you can serve those markets and definitely create a healthier community, absolutely.
Okay, interesting. Deanira, when I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking about the racial wealth gap and the role of homeownership in potentially bridging that gap for communities of color. Do community land trusts offer an opportunity to build wealth?
That's a really good question. So there's a couple of things that I would say in response. One is that our organization for many years sort of has straddled different fields, right? And so there's like a fair lending, civil rights frame to our work. There's the asset building world that overlaps. There's other kinds of economic justice movements and campaigns that we've been a part of. We were very deeply involved with community groups sort of leading up to the financial crash that were really aggressively promoting homeownership as the way to build wealth and security and hand that down intergenerationally. It is absolutely a tension and a real important issue, I think, to contend with when we talk about decommodifying housing, especially in the context of providing housing for very low-income people and people of color who've been excluded from other wealth-generating opportunities. That said, the financial crisis undid homeownership. There was net loss of homeownership among families of color and net loss of wealth generated through homeownership because of the way the market worked and the subprime lending bubble and the collapse that happened, and not to mention the sort of repercussions and of that kind of crisis for families that were displaced and so on. So it's a hard issue. I think that community land trust advocates would say, like, land in general should not be treated as something that you can just purchase and sell and control, that it should be part of a commons. And I think that there are different models for CLTs. Some CLTs, I was sort of being flippant before because Mitchell-Lama is not an area that we focus on, but limited equity housing co-ops certainly are very much part of the vision for a community land trust, where you can actually purchase your home in a housing development fund corporation or other kind of limited equity building, and there's maybe some equity that's built and appreciation over time, but it's not a windfall situation. And in fact, one of the things that CLTs are really important for is to make sure that housing stays affordable, particularly when public subsidy is put in, when a family's getting down payment assistance or some other kind of public investment, that they don't then take that, hang on to it for a few years, and that they're required to, and then flip it on the market, and there's that net loss of ownership of housing that's truly affordable. So it's complicated. I think there are real tensions, but I think there's a fundamental question to ask, which is whether housing should be the way that people generate wealth and security. Cooper Square, for example, CLT that's been around, talks a lot about social capital and equity, that having stable housing in which to raise your family has allowed those families, they're not going to cash in and move out, but they definitely have been able to stay in neighborhoods where they would have been displaced, and they were able to send their children to college, to participate in many other things. So it's a hard question.
Okay. Mo, when you were listening to Roseanne's presentation and looking at this kind of systems approach, I wonder if in your work you see all of those communities together, and if you find any areas that you could identify for improvement. Like, who's not at the table, who needs to be there?
So I think, so right now, currently, if you ask in my organization, everybody's at the table, right? There's no difference between someone who actually goes around the corner from our office, we're on 126th Street, and sleeps under the Metro North, from somebody who recently got an apartment to somebody who's in a shelter or in transitional living. All of their voices are equal for us, right? To veterans, right? We have a number of veterans. We have a number of formerly incarcerated. And at the end of the day, when we talk about housing, we actually have to talk about it. And when we talk about it, specifically a Picture the Homeless, we have to talk about it that there's actually not a housing crisis in New York. There are enough apartments to house folks, right? 64,000 people sleep in shelters every night. There is an affordability crisis in New York. And that's what we have to start to address. So I think when I looked at Roseanne's presentation, I looked at that intersection of all those folks coming together and actually having folks realize that it's not what the media has, like, which our members get stigmatized around being drug addicted, having too many kids. Like, we do not talk about the fact that 41% of homeless folks work every day. That's sad. That you can work every day and have to go home to a shelter. That means we're having an affordability crisis, and we have to solve it.
Is your work changing as like the economy goes from a period of real distress into what we're looking at as a recovery? Do you feel like it's changing?
So yeah, it evolves.
Yeah.
I wish it would go away. Right? I wish homelessness, like I really want to organize myself out of a job. I don't want to keep answering this in this city, right? I don't want to keep talking about us having to address homelessness. I don't want to keep talking about the fact that there is a 41% occupancy. What happened to the rest of the percent in luxury buildings when 64,000 people go to a shelter? Like, we should not be having that conversation as a community, as a society, and as this city. Like, so it feels like we're chipping away at a mountain with a hammer, really, because as soon as we think that, okay, we're going to get a sledge and we're really going to knock this mountain down, somebody's like, oh no, you're going to use that hammer. So we see bits and pieces, but the work, is evolving. We get some wins, but I think we won't get really solid wins until some administration, whether it's state, mayoral, or federal, decides that there is a housing crisis across this country and that there is a dedication to eradicating homelessness.
One of the things about the wealth gap, home ownership isn't right for everybody. You're absolutely right. Some people were lured into home ownership by low down payments and other problematic forms of lending. There's no doubt about that. But we also have to realize that working class and low and moderate income owners who own small multifamily homes, and that's part of the proposal here, but it's a more general issue, 2 and 3 family homes, they rent to other low and moderate income families for the most part. They ensure safety on the premises because they have a strong interest in making sure they have good tenants that are well behaved and enforce norms for those tenants, and they build wealth. And then they may move to a single family home somewhere else, and one of their tenants may buy that 2 or 3 family home. So there is a ladder of housing types, and we need to have all varieties of it. We can't think only about, let's just build as many subsidized apartments as we can. No, we need as much variegation in our housing market to serve the many needs of many types of households.
I just want to add something, which is, I think there's a couple of things here, and certainly we're very aware of, that, again, homeownership has been the one tool that families of color have traditionally had to build wealth, whereas white families have much more diversified and, sets of assets that they can draw on and pass down intergenerationally. I think the question is, if we're trying to address inequality, it's kind of like, maybe we need different approaches is what I'm saying. And maybe housing it's radical, right? But we're here, aren't we supposed to be bold? Like, maybe housing and shelter shouldn't be something that's kind of gambled on to the benefit of many, no doubt, but to the harm of many others. And it doesn't seem clear to us and the groups we work with and the researchers we work with that, continuing on this pattern is really going to do a lot to address the widening inequality gap that we have in our country and globally.
Seems to me Community Land Trust might want to go back to the mayoral campaign in 1878 of Henry George. And Henry George ran for mayor of New York on the proposal that only land should be taxed and not the buildings on it. And he believed that would create a fairer society overall. That interfaces in a complicated way with Community Land Trust, but he almost became mayor.
I just wanted to say one other thing before I answer that, if I may. Just, the city owns and has leverage over a whole array of different kinds of housing. And so NYCHA is definitely, a huge piece of it. NYCHA is the biggest landlord, right? And is it in the city or most neighborhoods or many neighborhoods? But also there's many other ways in which our coalition that's advocating for land trusts is encouraging the city to make better use of its powers. And for example, homeowners and other property owners that owe the city tax or water bills that have fallen behind, the city, since Giuliani days, has packaged and sold off those debts to private trusts that then add fees and aggressively come to collect, push properties into further distress, and can foreclose and on those properties. And so that's another example of where the city could actually steer properties like that are in distress into better outcomes, pathway to a nonprofit, housing developer, or some other approach that would keep the property owner intact in some cases, or could preserve it as affordable rather than losing that completely. Again, to your point regarding the community land trusts, in the case of community land trusts that are creating home ownership, there's a real mix. Some are very focused on very extreme and extremely low-income New Yorkers for whom homeownership may be out of reach. But for those that are looking at homeownership, there is some equity that can be built. It's just not going to be market rate flipping. I think that there's been a lot of discussion about sort of the evisceration of our safety net and sort of the reliance of people to save and invest in homeownership or whatever else it is to provide for themselves going forward. And I think that that's at least part of the answer. That sort of this kind of being able to get a windfall when you sell your home and your property, that's a way to build wealth and security, but there should be other ways, and there should be safety nets around older people and those that need to generate income. But again, the CLT model does allow for some equity and appreciation and wealth creation. It's just not this massive windfall that then takes that property out of the affordable stock.
Some of the people who never build wealth are public housing residents because they have no ownership possibilities. And we should think about, since we do have this mismatch between who lives in public housing and the number of bedrooms that Mo was talking about, we could think about, rather than building new housing for all of those tenants, recognizing their tenancy rights and paying them for them so that they can move somewhere else. Maybe they want to move south where things are less expensive, where they have family, so we can create turnover. But there is a natural human tendency to try to build wealth, and we need to respect it. Well, New York is booming today. Obviously, if you're unemployed, it's harder to find a place to live. But we're creating jobs at an unprecedented level today. So our problem is not a bad economy. We're not Detroit or Cleveland or St. Louis or Buffalo. This is a boom town right now. And it's pulling up a lot of relatively poor people. We have to make sure that the housing supply is aligned to their needs, and that we don't stand in the way of the market responding to them. That would be my view of it.
I have to beg to differ, just a tad. So the creation of raising the minimum wage to $15, there's this thinking like, oh, we raised the minimum wage to $15. When New York, to live in New York, you need the minimum wage to be, 31? Or some ridiculousness? So even though those jobs that are being created, tons and tons of those jobs are not going to the most neediest folks, right? Because of lack of higher education and all these ridiculous requirements around employment. And then those jobs that we are getting, for example, the jobs in Uber or Lyft, and this is not a judgment on them because I take both of them, but those jobs that are actually creating some form of regular sustainable income for Black and brown folks are actually not being counted as work. I have members who do both of them, right? And they still go back to a shelter. And I'm talking about members who are starting to be able to make a substantial amount, but the amount that they need to rent an apartment in this city and still survive, they can't get to. So even though some of them may be able to make, $2,000 a week, when they have to pay rent, that's $2,000, or have kids in daycare, that's, if you know, that's like $350 or $250 a month, and eat, and and all the other things, but yet you're told that that income is not recognized as work, then you're going home to a shelter. That's one. And what folks actually don't know is there are large sections of union jobs that are homeless. There is a major union here in New York City that estimates it has between 5,000 and 8,000 union members that are homeless.
I think all your points are great. It is worth keeping in mind, it used to be that we had thousands and thousands of units in single-room occupancy buildings. We said,
Well, you
oh,
can't do
those are offensive. We've got to get rid of those. But poor people who now live in shelters used to live in those kind of buildings. And before they offended our conscience, they were a good place to live.
Exactly. So I think we have to talk about our conscience. Not really housing worthy.
Yeah, one thing to build on something Mo said about the employment market and just the misalignment between work not being credited as work when you're going to apply for housing. Part of the randomness that is a problem in New York is we've got like 11 different production programs, 4 different subsidy programs. Like how many regulated units and different types of government subsidized programs. The fact that any one of these, publicly subsidized units, that you even as the landlord get to deny someone, on credit basis or so, it's like, what are we buying with our investment in housing? We have this ridiculously selective system. These lotteries for 80/20s. We should be ashamed. What are our intentions? Are we trying to house all of our people, or are we trying to create some winners? And this is just completely at odds with the intention of solving a housing crisis.
One of the things really quickly that we talk about in our business of homelessness report that y'all can look at online is the fact that, just a small tidbit, that we've asked our members to bring in their award letters that they get from the city that says how much the city pays towards their housing. In our report, you'll see an award letter for a member of ours who the city pays $7,568 a month, and she lives on 28th Street in a hotel room. That's the problem in this city. We are willing to do that, but then they say to her, we can't give you an apartment because you work Uber Eats and you don't have a stub. But we're willing to pay $7,500. I'm pretty sure we could find a decent apartment for $7,500.
Yeah, you got to ask yourself the question, what's the Bucky Fuller quote about, a system is perfectly designed. For whom is this system working? It's not struggling New Yorkers. Yeah.
That's what we need to know. Homelessness is a business.
Okay, well, I think that's a good place to stop. And thank you all for coming out tonight. I want to thank, again, the Museum of the City of New York for hosting this panel, and thank our panelists, please, for joining us.